I never imagined that losing my mother wouldn't be the hardest part of that winter. Not the night she took her final breath in the quiet corner of the assisted living home in Savannah, her once strong, capable hands trembling faintly in mine. Not even the moments I spent packing up her room, each knitted blanket, each Christmas photo framed with care, holding back the kind of grief that doesn't come with sobs, but with a heaviness that settles in your bones. No, the real pain, the kind that doesn't sting but corrodes slowly, came later, during what was supposed to be a simple family discussion around the old kitchen table she had loved so dearly. That's when my brother Curtis, wearing a steel grey tie and the confidence of someone used to speaking last and being obeyed, placed a thick folder on the table, looked at me with a calm smile and said, "We just need to make everything official, Emma. I've already handled the paperwork. You just need to sign." I had been here, this old Baldwin Street home, every day of the past 10 years, while Curtis, ever the distant son with perfect holiday timing, showed up only when it was convenient. It had been me managing the emergency calls, the physical therapy appointments, the mail, the medicine, the late-night falls. But now, less than a week after we buried the woman who gave us everything, he appeared not as a grieving son, but as the executor of what remained, our mother's house, her assets, her legacy. And when I flipped through that folder and saw my name tied to phrases like relinquishment of interest, unconditional authorization, and property transfer, I felt something shift. This wasn't about settling accounts, it was about erasure. And in that moment, I understood. I was about to fight a battle not for money, but for the truth, for justice, and for the echo of a mother's voice still rooted deep in the walls of this home. In the days that followed that kitchen table conversation, I tried to convince myself it was just grief clouding my judgment, that maybe Curtis truly meant well, and that the stack of documents he'd asked me to sign was nothing more than a routine formality meant to ease the process, as he put it. He kept repeating that phrase like a soft refrain, ease the process, as if the ache of losing a parent could somehow be soothed with a notary stamp and a ballpoint pen. And perhaps because I was exhausted, or maybe because I still clung to the hope that my brother, despite the distance and the years of absence, hadn't become someone who saw our mother's death as an opportunity, I let it slide. But something inside me, that quiet, persistent voice that had grown sharper over the years, told me not to sign anything blindly. So instead of adding my signature, I told him I needed time, that I'd let a friend of mine, a retired probate clerk, glance over the paperwork. The smile on Curtis's face didn't fade, but it tightened, just enough for me to notice the change. His fingers tapped once, then twice on the polished oak table, and he leaned back with that familiar mix of charm and pressure I had seen him use on boardroom clients, and family alike. "Of course, Emma," he said, voice still sweet, but edged with something firmer. "Take your time. Just remember, the longer we wait, the harder it is to keep the rest of the family calm." That was the first time he mentioned the rest of the family, even though no one else had shown up to help with arrangements, no one else had kept vigil in Mom's final days, and no one else had bothered to ask how I was holding up. Suddenly, my decision to pause became an inconvenience, an obstacle to some invisible plan already set in motion. And just like that, I began to see it. Not a request, but a strategy. A week later, I received a letter, not from Curtis, but from a law firm up in Atlanta I'd never heard of. It was crisp, formal, and cold. In it, they stated that per a recent agreement, one I allegedly signed, full ownership of our mother's estate had been transferred to my brother's name. The house, the land, even the small inheritance left in her retirement account, all of it had been legally reassigned, filed, and finalized. I stared at the envelope in my hands, my chest tightening with a sensation that had no name. Not anger, not quite disbelief, but something older and heavier, like betrayal with a bitter aftertaste. I hadn't signed anything, I knew that. But what chilled me wasn't just the falsehood. It was how prepared they were to make it look real. I called Curtis immediately, heart pounding, voice trembling more than I cared to admit, and asked him what this was, how any of this could have happened without my consent. And without missing a beat, he laughed. Not cruelly, not at first, but with the kind of casual indifference that says, "I've already won." "Emma, you must have forgotten. We talked about this," he said, tone light, almost condescending. "You gave me verbal consent. That's enough under state law if it's corroborated. And don't worry, I've already taken care of the taxes, the filings. Everything's clean." I don't remember exactly what I said in response. Maybe I didn't say anything at all. But what I do remember, clearly, viscerally, is the moment I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an error in the paperwork or a communication breakdown. This was a calculated maneuver, a sleight of hand wrapped in legal jargon and blood ties, executed while I was still reeling from burying the only person who had truly stood beside me my whole life. And when I reached out to extended family, to friends, to people who had once told me they'd always have my back, I was met not with outrage or support, but with the same polite indifference Curtis had mastered. Some said, "He's the eldest, maybe he's just doing what he thinks is right." Others whispered, "You shouldn't make this about money, Emma. It's not what your mother would have wanted." But they didn't know. They didn't know what I'd sacrificed. They didn't know the nights I stayed up cleaning wounds, balancing medications, fighting with Medicare providers just so Mom could have the dignity of staying in her own home. They didn't know what it felt like to be erased, not with words but with documents, signatures, and the silent complicity of people who looked away. Curtis didn't just take the house, he took the story. He rewrote the ending. And he thought I would stay quiet, that I would mourn in silence while he rebranded our mother's memory into an asset portfolio and a clean sale. But grief, real grief, doesn't weaken a person. Sometimes it sharpens them. And in that sharpening, something old awoke in me, something I thought I had buried alongside my mother. Curtis didn't know about the letter. Not yet. In the weeks that followed the letter from the law firm, I tried to hold on to the belief that someone, anyone, would step forward and say, "This isn't right." I wasn't looking for a crusade, just a voice, a single voice other than my own to acknowledge that something had gone terribly wrong. But what I found instead was a silence more deafening than any accusation. It crept in through the phone calls that went unanswered, through the polite but evasive texts from cousins who once spent every 4th of July at our lake cabin, and through the awkward pauses in conversation whenever the word inheritance brushed the surface of a family gathering. At first, I thought maybe they didn't know, that Curtis had kept it quiet, or worse, misrepresented the story in his usual polished way. The kind of narrative that makes you sound reasonable even while you're rewriting history. But then I heard from Aunt Beverly, who called under the guise of checking on me, but quickly steered the conversation toward forgiveness and letting go. And it became clear that the version of events they'd been told painted me as the one causing trouble, the one digging up drama when we should be focusing on what Mom would have wanted. As if protecting my mother's wishes, her dignity, and the truth she trusted me with was something petty or selfish. They didn't see the long nights I spent alone with her, holding her hand while she slipped in and out of lucidity, whispering stories from her childhood just to calm the tremors. They didn't know that I was the one who remembered her favourite hymns when the hospice nurse asked, or that I was the one who stood by her side when she begged me, through tears and fading strength, not to let the house be sold to strangers. None of that mattered now. Not when Curtis had paper polish and a rehearsed smile that could charm a courtroom or a church pew in equal measure. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. I had already felt the sting of that. No, what broke me was the quiet, civilized doubt that spread like a stain across every conversation. It was the way people looked at me sideways, like I was making a fuss over something trivial, like I was being emotional or stubborn, or, worst of all, greedy. Greedy. As if what I wanted was money or square footage, and not the simple truth that I had been there when no one else had, that I had done the hard, quiet work of loving someone at the end of their life. Even the few friends I had confided in hesitated. They offered sympathy but not support, the kind of sympathy that keeps a safe distance, that says, "That sounds tough," but never asks, "What can I do?" I could see it in their eyes, the discomfort, the way they wondered if maybe Curtis was right, if maybe I was just too caught up in my emotions to see things clearly. And it was in that isolation, more than the theft, more than the signatures or the legal threats, that I began to understand how people lose themselves completely. Not through one grand betrayal, but through 1,000 tiny dismissals, 1,000 instances where no one stands up, where no one says, "I believe you." I stopped going to family dinners. I stopped answering calls I knew would lead nowhere. And I began to sit in the living room every evening, in my mother's old rocking chair, surrounded by the silence she left behind. Not because I was defeated, but because I needed to feel something solid again, something real. That house, though legally no longer mine, still smelled like her. The walls still held the memories of Sunday breakfasts and Christmas mornings and stories read aloud long after bedtime. I stayed not because I was clinging to the past, but because it was the only place where the truth hadn't yet been erased. I had been erased from the paperwork, from the family narrative, from the casual conversations that now treated Curtis as the responsible, grieving son and me as the unstable sister who couldn't let go. But I hadn't been erased from the house. Not yet, and certainly not from the letter, the one thing Curtis didn't know existed. A letter written in my mother's own hand, sealed in an envelope marked with my name, hidden in the bottom drawer of her sewing cabinet beneath spools of thread and fabric scraps. I hadn't opened it yet, not because I was afraid of what it might say, but because something told me the moment I read it, everything would change. And once you see the truth laid bare, in handwriting you know better than your own, you can't unsee it, you can't pretend that silence is still an option. There's a particular kind of silence that follows betrayal, not the kind that begs to be broken with confrontation or rage, but the still, deliberate kind that wraps itself around you like armor, not to hide weakness, but to protect the one part of yourself they haven't yet stolen. In those long days after the estate was taken from me and the world turned away without so much as a glance back, I said nothing. Not to Curtis, not to the lawyers, not to the family who had decided quietly and efficiently that I no longer belonged in the story. But I watched, and I remembered. Because when you've lived your whole life in the shadows of someone else's certainty, you learn to listen with a different kind of attention, to notice the pauses between words, the quiet discomfort behind polite smiles, the places where truth doesn't quite line up. And somewhere in that silence, something began to stir, not out of bitterness or vengeance, but out of clarity. The slow, undeniable understanding that if I didn't stand for what my mother had truly intended, no one else would. It was a Sunday afternoon when I first sensed it. The pull, the whisper, the sense that something she'd left behind still waited to be found. I had been cleaning out the sewing room, a small space tucked behind the laundry, filled with sunlight and dust and the faint scent of lavender sachets long forgotten in drawers. It wasn't a room Curtis had cared about. In fact, I doubt he even remembered it existed. But for me, it was where I had spent hours beside her as a child, learning how to thread a needle, listening to her hum along to the radio, watching the way her hands moved, precise, graceful, sure. And it was in that room, buried beneath a drawer of old thread spools and button tins, that I found the box. It was no larger than a shoebox tied with fraying green ribbon, its edges worn soft by time and touch. There was no label, no markings, just a faint imprint on the top where, Years ago, someone had rested a teacup without a coaster. I don't know how long I sat with it in my lap before opening it, only that when I did, the air seemed to change. Inside was a collection of what most people might overlook: receipts from the hardware store, grocery lists written in her slanted cursive, a faded church program from a Sunday we'd long since forgotten. But beneath those mundane fragments was something else. A letter, folded carefully in thirds, addressed in my mother's handwriting to E. Grace Whitmore. My full name, the one she only used when she meant something serious. The moment I saw that, I knew. Her handwriting hadn't changed much over the years. The strokes were still careful, deliberate, the ink slightly faded, but unmistakably hers. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, not out of fear, but reverence. I hadn't yet read a single word, but somehow I knew this letter had been written not in haste or panic, but in preparation. The kind of preparation only a mother makes when she's been watching the shifting of tides and knows a storm is coming. And in that instant, I realized something I hadn't let myself admit before. She knew. She knew what Curtis was capable of, or at the very least, she feared that if the moment came when money and legacy collided with morality, he might not choose wisely. This letter wasn't a warning. It was a lifeline. I didn't read it right away. Not because I didn't want to, but because something inside me whispered that once I did, the path forward would change. I wouldn't be able to sit quietly in the house, clinging to the echoes of what used to be. I wouldn't be able to grieve passively, to let people say what they wanted, and walk away with my silence as their permission. Once I read that letter, I would know, and once I knew, I would be obligated to act. So I waited until evening when the light had softened and the shadows grew long across the floorboards my father once laid by hand. I sat in my mother's rocking chair, placed the letter in my lap, and stared out the window toward the old maple tree she used to read beneath in the summers. Then, with steady breath and steady heart, I opened it. And what I read changed everything. The letter began not with warnings or explanations, but with gratitude, the kind that humbles you because it comes from someone who saw everything and chose to speak not in anger, but in love. My mother's words were soft but clear, a kind of farewell written with the calm precision of a woman who knew the world wouldn't always be fair, but also believed her daughter could survive it. She wrote about the nights she pretended to be asleep while I changed her dressings and whispered stories to distract her from the pain, about the quiet comfort of hearing my footsteps in the hallway, knowing I was still there even when the world outside had moved on. And then, with a shift in tone so subtle I almost missed it, she spoke of Curtis, of her fears, not rooted in resentment, but in realism. She didn't accuse, she didn't condemn. She simply observed, like a woman who had learned over a lifetime, that charm can be a disguise, and silence, a strategy. She knew he would come for the house. She knew he might try to rewrite the narrative, to position himself as the responsible son in the eyes of others, while quietly rearranging the pieces of her life to suit his convenience. But what she also knew, what she had counted on, was that I wouldn't go looking for justice unless I was pushed to the edge, because that's the kind of daughter she raised. Not combative, not entitled, but careful, loyal, and, when it mattered, unshakable. And that's why she left more than a letter. At the end of the page, beneath her signature, she wrote just one line that changed the air in the room. "If things unfold as I fear they might, speak to Mr. Alden. He will know what to do." Mr. Alden. I hadn't heard that name in years. He was my parents' attorney when I was a teenager, a quiet man with kind eyes and a voice that never rose above a murmur, who always brought his own coffee to the house because he didn't want to be a bother. I remembered him vaguely from meetings I hadn't been invited to attend, from envelopes I'd seen him hand to my father, from the way my mother always said, "He's not just our lawyer, he's our witness." I found his office tucked away in a quiet part of town, A small brick building hidden behind a canopy of oaks, with a brass plaque so worn it looked almost forgotten. But when I walked through the door and said my name, something shifted in his posture. Not surprise, but recognition, like a moment he had rehearsed for, but never hoped would arrive. Without saying much, he invited me into his office, pulled a leather-bound folder from a locked drawer, and placed it gently in front of me. "Your mother gave me instructions," he said, his voice steady. "If you came here, I was to give you this. No one else." Inside the folder was not just a letter but a legal document, a full and notarized will, updated 6 months before her death, witnessed by 2 members of her church and filed under seal. In it, my mother left clear directives. The house, the land, the remaining assets were to be divided, yes, but with a specific condition, that the authority to distribute or delay any portion of the estate would fall solely to the child who had provided full-time care in the final 3 years of her life. Me. There was no ambiguity, no loophole, no space for reinterpretation. Even more damning was the clause that addressed Curtis directly. It stated in quiet, unflinching language that any attempt to override, conceal, or replace this testament would be grounds for full disinheritance, and that legal mechanisms had already been put in place to freeze transfers or sales made under false pretenses. "The man you call your brother may believe charm can outpace truth," she wrote in a separate note tucked within the folder. "But paper holds memory longer than applause." I sat there for a long time, not speaking, not moving, just holding the weight of that document in my hands, realizing that I had not been alone after all, that even in her final months my mother had seen this coming and had chosen to act not out of fear, but out of faith that I would rise when it mattered. She hadn't just written a will. She had left me a map, not to money or property, but to dignity, to truth, to something no one could strip away with a forged signature or a rehearsed speech. Curtis had rewritten the story, but he had done so without knowing that the original manuscript still existed, one that bore our mother's handwriting, her intentions, and her unwavering clarity. And now that it had returned to my hands, the erasure was no longer complete. Something had shifted. The silence had broken. And the next move was mine. I didn't call him right away. There are some truths too heavy to deliver over the phone, and some confrontations that deserve to unfold face to face, not for the sake of drama, but because when someone tries to erase your voice, looking them in the eye becomes its own kind of justice. So I waited until the next Sunday, the same day of the week he'd always reserved for brunches and image building. The day when he wore his best sweaters and spoke just loud enough at the country club to be overheard by the right people. I asked to meet him at the house, our mother's house, though at that moment, only I truly understood what that still meant. When he arrived, he looked relaxed, as if everything had already settled neatly in his favor. He stepped through the door without hesitation, commenting on how the new paint color he'd picked for the foyer was finally starting to grow on him, as though this place was now an extension of his personal taste, and not the heart of a life he had only hovered around when it was convenient. I offered him coffee, not because I was trying to be polite, but because I wanted the balance of the room to feel unchanged, like he hadn't already crossed every line and burned every bridge between us. He accepted, of course, and settled into Dad's old recliner like it had always belonged to him, unaware that he was about to be stripped of every illusion he'd so carefully built. I handed him the folder without a word. No speeches, no build-up. Just the quiet weight of paper that had more power than any accusation I could have spoken. At first, he laughed, that casual, dismissive chuckle he used whenever he thought someone was being too emotional or dramatic. He thumbed through the pages with the confidence of someone certain he would find nothing threatening until he didn't. His fingers froze, his eyes narrowed. And then the silence came. It wasn't long, but it was telling. The kind of pause that only happens when a person realizes the ground beneath them isn't as solid as they thought. He cleared his throat, placed the documents on the table as if they were contaminated, and said, "Where did you get this?" I told him the truth, about the letter, the sewing room, and Mr. Alden. I kept my voice steady, not because I wasn't angry, but because I wanted him to feel the calm resolve that comes from knowing you've been underestimated for far too long and are no longer willing to pretend otherwise. He stood, pacing now, no longer in control of the space the way he had been when he walked in. "Emma," he said, trying to summon that older brother tone I hadn't heard since we were kids, the one meant to reassure and redirect. "You don't understand how complicated this is. You don't know what Mum was going through at the end. She wasn't herself." But I did understand. I had been there. I had seen her lucid, sharp, and unwavering on the day she gave that folder to Mr. Alden. The same day she asked me to pick up her favourite tea and insisted on setting aside a new pair of slippers, just in case we had guests. She had been more herself that week than she had been in months. Curtis's voice rose, not in anger, but in something worse, desperation disguised as disappointment. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Do you want to ruin the family? Do you really want to air all this out in court?" And that's when I knew he wasn't afraid of losing money. He was afraid of losing control, of the narrative, of the legacy, of the mask he had worn so well for so long. I looked at him, not with hatred, but with a kind of mournful clarity and said, "This isn't about court. This is about Mom, about what she wanted. You had a chance to honour that, and you chose yourself instead." He didn't respond, not right away. He just stood there, blinking, breathing hard, caught somewhere between indignation and disbelief. And then, in the voice of someone who realizes the tide has turned, he said quietly, "You're going to regret this." But I wouldn't. Not today. Not ever. Because I wasn't fighting out of vengeance or spite. I was standing up for the woman who raised me to believe that silence in the face of injustice isn't grace, it's surrender. And I had surrendered enough. As he left, he didn't slam the door. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just walked out with the same polished stride he always had, but this time it was hollow. Because for the first time, he wasn't the one in control of the room. And I, for the first time, felt like my voice, my quiet, steady, long overlooked voice, had finally been heard. After Curtis walked out that day, the air in the house didn't feel triumphant. It felt still, not empty, but cleansed, as if something that had been festering beneath the surface for far too long had finally been exposed to light. I didn't cry and I didn't celebrate. I simply sat in the quiet, in the same kitchen where my mother used to hum while chopping onions, and set out 2 cups even when no one was expected. And I let myself feel what I had been denying for weeks. Not anger, but release. I could have taken him to court. I had every right. The legal documents were airtight, the timeline irrefutable, and the lawyer who had once been dismissed as old-fashioned by my brother had now become the linchpin of a truth too solid to contest. But instead of pursuing punishment, I chose something that surprised even me. I chose to restore what my mother had intended, no more and no less. Because deep down, I knew she hadn't prepared all those contingencies to fuel a war between her children. She did it to protect peace, to preserve dignity, and to ensure that the love she spent a lifetime giving wouldn't be twisted into a weapon. So I instructed Mr. Alden to issue a formal statement to the estate court, affirming the validity of her will, confirming my authority to distribute the property, and requesting that the previous unauthorized transfers be reversed and sealed from public inquiry. I didn't ask for sanctions, and I didn't demand an apology. I asked only for accuracy, for the legal records to reflect what my mother had signed, what she had believed in, and what she had tried to protect in her final days. The house, though legally mine to do with as I pleased, wasn't sold or renovated or used to make a point. I restored it, not with new cabinets or polished stone countertops, but with the same curtains she'd sewn herself. The old clock she insisted still kept better time than any digital thing, and the stack of church bulletins she never threw away, because you never know when someone might need the date of that baptism. I kept the home as it had been when she was alive, imperfect, comforting, and undeniably hers, not because I was holding on, but because some places aren't meant to be erased. As for the funds, I honoured her original intention. She had once told me, after a neighbour's daughter dropped out of college due to medical bills, that if she ever had enough left over, she'd start a scholarship. Not for the top students, but for the persistent ones, the quiet ones, the ones who kept showing up when no one expected them to. With the portion of her estate that remained, I created the Grace Whitmore Endowment for first-generation women in healthcare, and for the first time since her passing, I felt like her voice was not only being remembered, but amplified. Curtis never contacted me again, not to fight, not to apologize, not even to ask about the outcome. I heard through a cousin that he had moved to Asheville, took a new job, and mentioned to some that things got complicated after Mom passed, which I suppose is his version of the story now. And I've made peace with that, because the older I get, the more I understand. Some people don't need to be punished to lose. Sometimes the most painful consequence is knowing they were written out of the legacy not by force but by truth. And the truth is, I didn't win anything. I simply reclaimed what was never his to take. Now every morning, I sit on the porch with the same cup my mother used for decades, the one with the tiny crack in the handle she refused to throw away. And I listen to the birds that always returned each spring to the same trees she planted herself. I don't feel vindicated. I feel whole. And that, I've come to realize, is the quietest and most lasting kind of justice there is. I've come to understand that the most profound transformations don't always arrive with loud declarations or grand victories. Sometimes they emerge from quiet decisions made in solitude, the choice to keep standing when no one claps, the choice to speak when everyone expects your silence, and the choice to preserve not just what was taken from you, but who you had to become to take it back. What happened with Curtis wasn't unique. I've met too many people since, women and men alike, who carry the quiet weight of having been betrayed not by strangers, but by those who once stood beside them in childhood photos, who shared dinner tables and holiday prayers, only to turn cold when legacy, property, or pride entered the room. And if you're one of them, if you've been made to feel invisible in a family that only saw you as useful when you were silent, I need you to hear this. Your story is not over just because someone else tried to rewrite it. It's easy to mistake quiet for weakness. People like Curtis build their power on the assumption that you won't question them, that you'll accept being erased as the price of peace, that you'll convince yourself justice is too much trouble. But I've learned that real strength doesn't need to shout. It just needs to remain. Unmoved, undeterred, unapologetically present. My mother's gift to me wasn't just the letter, or the legal protection, or even the trust she placed in me to carry out her wishes. Her true legacy was the example she lived, a belief that dignity doesn't come from what others give you, but from what you choose not to surrender, not even when you're outnumbered, outvoted, or outmaneuvered. I didn't win by outsmarting Curtis. I didn't need to. I stood where my mother once stood, in the truth she left behind, and let it speak louder than any defense I could have mounted. Because justice, when it comes not from vengeance but from restoration, doesn't just settle the score, it settles the soul. So if you're sitting in your own kind of silence tonight, wondering if you were foolish to believe that love should be enough, or feeling like maybe you were wrong to ask for the respect you deserved, let me be the voice that reminds you, you are not alone, you are not weak, and you are not done. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge is not destruction, it's survival. With your values intact, your voice restored, and your story reclaimed on your terms. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever been dismissed, betrayed, or underestimated by your own family, know this: you are not invisible. Subscribe for more true stories of resilience, justice, and the quiet power of standing tall, even when the world tries to bury you. And if you've lived a story like mine, I hope you'll share it in the comments, because your voice, like mine, deserves to be heard.